Imagine being the voice that crosses borders to save lives. Muhammad Ali tried to be that voice, standing up to governments, generals, and even terrorists. What happened when he stood between prisoners and their tormentors is a story few know. In the years when Muhammad Ali was already more than a world champion, he carried with him a weight far greater than any belt, that of being a symbol. For millions, Ali represented resistance, justice, and courage. But far from the ring, where punches were thrown not with gloves but with weapons, a new struggle arose: humanitarian missions in war-torn territories. While most saw Ali simply as the greatest boxer of all time, there were those who saw him as a mediator capable of dialogue where politicians failed. His presence was charismatic, his words had an impact, and his name opened doors where traditional diplomacy had previously been closed. He traveled not just to fight in arenas, but to face cold, tense rooms where lives hung in the balance. Armed men, prisoners, begging for freedom, skeptical authorities. There was no audience, no applause, only silence, fear, and hope. There, he knew every step was risky. He might emerge a hero, but he could also lose his own life or tarnish his reputation forever. And it was precisely in one of these moments that his most daring mission took shape. A plane full of hostages, an armed group, willing to do anything, the government, incapable of negotiation, and Ali, alone, trusting only in his voice and the faith that he could transform hatred into compassion. This is not a story about well-placed blows or belts raised before the crowd. It is about the courage to enter an invisible ring, where the opponent was human despair. Now, you will learn in detail how Muhammad Ali, the giant of the ring, tried to face a different fight, saving lives that had no one to turn to. It was the early 1990s, and the world watched with concern as international crises multiplied. Civil wars, dictatorships, armed groups kidnapping innocent people to pressure governments. Amid this chaos, Muhammad Ali, already retired from boxing and with his health weakened by Parkinson's, received an unexpected call. It wasn't to return to the ring, nor to a charity event. It was a silent, almost desperate request: to negotiate the release of prisoners held by hostile forces in the Middle East. The invitation didn't come from presidents or diplomats. It was a direct plea from grieving families, who saw in Ali a man capable of touching hearts where politics only created barriers. Ali knew this wasn't a glamorous adventure. At every step of this mission, there was the risk of ambush, the risk of failure, the risk of becoming a hostage himself. But for him, refusal wasn't an option. His entire life had taught him that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but rather facing the impossible despite it. When he boarded the plane for that unstable territory, the silence inside was already heavy. Advisors whispered, security guards eyed each other suspiciously. None of them were sure they would return home. Ali, however, stared out the window, his eyes fixed on the horizon, repeating in a low voice, "I didn't come to fight for myself. I came to fight for them." The arrival was anything but warm. Military vehicles surrounded the convoy on the runway. Armed soldiers ordered them to disembark slowly, hands visible. The atmosphere was one of absolute tension. Any sudden movement could be interpreted as provocation. There, with slow steps, he disembarked last. His body was no longer as agile as before, but his presence carried a weight impossible to ignore. One of the commanders, accustomed to facing ministers and diplomats, hesitated when he met the former champion's gaze. There was something different in that look. It wasn't arrogance or superiority. It was a mixture of compassion and firmness that disarmed without needing words. At that first meeting, the atmosphere was tense. A small room, windows closed, fans spinning lazily overhead. Armed men leaned against the walls. In the center, a worn wooden table. On the other side, military leaders demanded guarantees, tossed around numbers, and accused the West of hypocrisy. Ali remained silent for long minutes, simply listening. Then, when he finally spoke, he used neither diplomatic terms nor political arguments. He said, "I know what it's like to be called an enemy. I know what it's like to be hated for fighting the system. But I also know that no one is born with hatred in their heart. Hatred is taught, and compassion can be taught too." The words echoed like invisible punches. There weren't enough translators to lessen the impact of his voice. Some leaders lowered their eyes, others snorted in disdain, but no one dared interrupt. Ali didn't offer money or promises of power. He offered only the authority of someone who had already bled for his ideals. It was impossible not to respect him. Meanwhile, in nearby cells, American and European prisoners waited. Many had not seen sunlight for months. Families begged from across the world for news. Ollie's presence, however, began to spread through the corridors like a whisper of hope. Guards whispered, "The champion is here. The man who faced giants has come for you." For the prisoners, this simple phrase was like breathing again. But every word spoken at that table came at a price. An angry military leader slammed his hand on the table and retorted, "You don't understand. These men are bargaining chips. They give us a voice. If we give them up, we lose everything." Silence fell heavily. Ollie calmly looked up and replied, "To lose everything is to lose your humanity. And without humanity, no voice will last." The negotiations, however, were far from over. The doors wouldn't open that night. But something had changed. The enemies no longer saw a boxer or a foreigner before them. They saw a man willing to risk his life for strangers. And at that moment, without even realizing it, Ollie had already struck the first decisive blow. The chapter closed with a phrase that echoed in every corner of that suffocating room. The real fight is not against an adversary. It is against silence in the face of injustice. The second morning began as a psychological test. The sun had barely risen, but the room where Ali was to return for the negotiations was already filled with armed men, their faces grim and their eyes suspicious. The heat was stifling, and the tension in the air seemed to double the weight of each breath. The hostages remained silent in dark cells, cut off from the world, but they knew something unusual was happening. Guards murmured among themselves. Ollie's name circulated like a forbidden whisper, and even locked away. The prisoners felt a spark of hope grow. Ollie entered the room unhurriedly. There was no hurry in his posture, but every movement carried purpose. His body no longer obeyed as before. His hands trembled slightly. The result of the advancing Parkinson's, but he made a point of keeping his gaze steady, like a champion who never lets his guard down. He sat before the rebel leaders and broke the silence with a short phrase, "You know my name, but I have come to know your hearts." The interpreter repeated it, and the impact was immediate. Some frowned, others laughed nervously, but no one could ignore it. One of the leaders, younger and more impetuous, retorted harshly, "Your governments have only offered us contempt. Why should we trust you?" Ollie took a deep breath, rested his hands on the table, and replied, "Because I am not a government. I am a man, and I know what it is to feel used, discarded, treated as nothing. When I fought against the Vietnam War, they called me a traitor. They took everything from me, but they never took away my dignity. Today, you have the chance to show that you too have dignity by returning these men to their families." The silence after his words was deafening. The ceiling fan seemed to spin more slowly. The men's eyes met, some visibly uncomfortable, others thoughtful. For the first time, the negotiation wasn't about numbers or politics. It was about honor. It was about humanity. Meanwhile, in one of the cells, a prisoner named Michael listened to the sounds coming from the hallway. He pressed his ear against the damp wall and whispered to his fellow inmates, "He's here. I heard the guards say, Muhammad Ali is negotiating for us." Two men who had lost hope. These words were like water in a desert. They didn't know if they would ever return home, but just the fact that someone like Ali would risk his life for them made them feel less forgotten. In the negotiating room, the mood oscillated between hostility and doubt. One of the elders slammed his fist on the table and said, "You talk about humanity, but where was your humanity when our people were being massacred? You ignored us for decades." Ollie didn't shy away. He approached, looked him in the eye and replied, "I can't change the past, but I can be here today. And today, I choose to fight for life, not revenge." That response was more disarming than any right hand during his time as a champion. The older man leaned back in his chair, exhaling a heavy sigh. For the first time, cracks appeared in the wall of resistance. The negotiations were gaining momentum, but the risk was constant. Any slip-up, any misinterpreted phrase, could cost them all. Local government officials were on the lookout, ready to blame Ali if things got out of hand. And across the ocean, desperate families awaited news, praying for the unlikely success of this mission. At the end of that round, nothing was officially decided. No hostages had yet been released. But there was something new in the air: respect. The leaders, however reluctant, no longer saw Ali as just an interloper. They saw him as a figure who could not be bought or intimidated. And this realization was an invisible but powerful victory. Before leaving the room, Ollie slowly stood up, looked at everyone, and declared, "I have no armies, I have no weapons. My only weapon is the truth, and it is with that I will fight to the end." The tension, however, only increased, and it was on this thread of hope that Ollie walked, knowing that the next encounter could decide not only the fate of the hostages, but also his own life. And if you've made it this far, it's because this story touched you too, so be a part of it. Like, subscribe to the channel, and comment on what you would have done in Ali's place. Your participation is what keeps this voice alive and helps us continue bringing stories worth remembering, and to help us continue creating videos, buy our ebook in the first link in the description. Besides motivating us, this helps us improve the quality of our content. The next morning the mood had changed drastically. If before there had been hesitation and a certain respect, now the looks were harder, the gestures colder. A rumor was circulating through the corridors of the building where Ollie was staying. Part of the armed faction refused to negotiate. For them, releasing prisoners was a sign of weakness, and allowing a famous foreigner to interfere was almost an affront. The tension was palpable, and even the interpreters seemed to swallow hard before translating each sentence. Ollie re-entered the meeting room. The silence was so heavy it felt suffocating. The sound of soldiers' boots echoed on the cement floor, reminding everyone that this was no ordinary diplomatic table, but a psychological minefield. Before he could even sit down, one of the younger commanders stood up abruptly, pointed his finger at Ali and said, "You think you can come here, use your name, and embarrass us in front of the world?" The room erupted in murmurs. For a moment, it seemed the negotiations were over. Ollie didn't answer immediately. He took a deep breath, looked the man in the eye and said, "I haven't come to shame anyone. I've come to prove that true strength lies not in holding men in chains, but in setting them free." The translation echoed, and the silence returned. But this time the silence wasn't one of respect, but of threat. Suddenly, the door was flung open. Two guards dragged one of the hostages into the room, a thin, exhausted man with unshaven eyes and sunken eyes. His arms were tied, and his mouth was covered with a dirty cloth. The younger commander smirked and declared, "Look, champion, this is one of the ones you want to save. But tell me, why should we let him go? He's worth nothing to us, but he's worth a lot to yours. So why not use him to the fullest?" The scene was a cruel blow. Ollie stood up immediately, his eyes fixed on the prisoner who could barely stand. The silence in the room was broken by Ollie's trembling voice, "Because every life is precious. This man has a family waiting for him. Every day he spends here is torture for them too. Freeing him won't take away your strength. It will show the world that you still have heart." The prisoner was taken back, and the room descended into heated discussions. Some leaders murmured among themselves, trying to convince the more radical ones that Ollie's presence could be used to their advantage, as propaganda. Others, however, saw him as a threat that needed to be silenced. Tensions were mounting, and at any moment, a hasty decision could cost lives. That night, Ollie was taken to a small room, guarded by two armed men. The room had only a narrow bed and a barred window. He couldn't sleep. His hands were shaking more than usual. His tired body was crying out for rest, but his mind wouldn't stop. "Will I make it, or will I just be another prisoner tomorrow?" he asked himself silently. Outside, in the darkness, one of the guards muttered to his colleague, "I don't understand why he came. He could be in his mansion, surrounded by wealth, but he chose this. Maybe he's crazy, or maybe he's the only one who truly believes what he says." These words, even spoken with a tone of doubt, summed up Ollie's impact on everyone he crossed paths with. He was seen not just as a mediator, but as someone willing to risk everything for what he believed in. The next day, when he returned to the negotiating table, one of the older leaders spoke. His voice was grave, marked by the weight of experience. "You don't understand, Ali. Here, hate is our language. We grew up with it. We fed it to our children, and now you ask us to give it up." Ollie leaned forward, looked the man in the eye, and replied, "Hate is easy. Any coward can hate. The hard part is forgiving, choosing compassion. That's why I'm here. Not to humiliate you, but to prove that you can be greater than the chains you created." The response didn't end the conflict, but it opened a crack in the wall of resistance. Some eyes flashed with uncertainty, others hardened even further. The fight was just beginning, but it was already clear that Ollie faced opponents who didn't use gloves, but rather hatred as their weapon. And in that moment, as he left the room, he knew the next encounter wouldn't just involve words. There would be direct threats, perhaps even violence. But he wouldn't back down, because, deep down, Ollie believed that some battles are worth a lifetime even if victory is never guaranteed. The next morning, the hot wind blew dust through the narrow streets, and the sky seemed heavier than ever. Rumors were spreading. There were internal divisions among the rebel leaders. Some wanted to use Ali as a showcase to show the world that they had the power to negotiate. Others, more radical, demanded his immediate arrest, perhaps even his execution, as an example that they bowed to no one. This climate of discord turned Ollie's every step into a calculated risk. A simple mistake, a misplaced word, could be the spark that would lead to disaster. Ali was called to another meeting, but the atmosphere was different. The room no longer felt just tense, it felt dangerous. The armed men who had previously stood to the side now held their rifles more firmly, their fingers close to the trigger. Their looks weren't just suspicious, but threatening. As he entered, Ali felt the weight of their intentions. Still, he didn't hesitate. He walked with slow, steady steps to the chair in the center of the room. Before he could sit down, one of the radicals slammed his hand on the table and shouted, "You talk about compassion, but who had compassion for us? You're just a puppet, sent to deceive us. Perhaps we should end this now." The interpreter hesitated as he translated, but the words were already clear in his tone. The silence that followed was deadly. Some leaders stared at Ali as if expecting a desperate reaction, but he, with characteristic calm, lifted his chin slightly and replied, "I didn't come to deceive anyone. I came because I believe the life of an innocent man is worth more than any talk of war. If you kill me, you will only prove that hatred has won. But if you listen to me, you will have something you will never achieve with weapons. Respect." These words fell like thunder in the room. Some murmured, others shifted nervously. Tension exploded when the radical who had spoken raised his gun and pointed it directly at Ali. Time seemed to freeze. The hearts of those present raced, and even the translators lost the color in their faces. Ali, motionless, stared at the gun without blinking. His hands trembled, but not from fear, from illness. And in that moment, he seemed larger than everyone in the room, even unarmed. "Shoot if you want," he said firmly, "but know that by doing so, you will be killing the hope of thousands who believe there is still humanity in the hearts of men." The radical hesitated. His heavy breathing betrayed the internal struggle between pride and reason, until the oldest leader of the faction banged his cane on the ground and shouted, "Enough. This is not how we'll solve this." The gun was lowered, but the warning had been given. Ali wasn't just negotiating for the lives of the prisoners, he was negotiating his own life every second. Meanwhile, outside, the prisoners remained silent, but they sensed subtle changes. The guards' treatment oscillated between hostility and a strange caution. One of them, while delivering food, whispered, "The champion is alive. He spoke for you." These few words rekindled a glimmer of hope in hearts that had almost died. Back in the makeshift room where he slept, Ali reflected on the recent events. His body was tired, his mind exhausted, but his resolve was unbreakable. He thought of the hostages, imagined the faces of the families waiting for them. He thought of his own childhood, when he learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to face it. He remembered a phrase he always carried with him, "If my mind can conceive it, and my heart can believe it, then I can do it." And it was this belief that kept him going. That night, one of the moderate leaders secretly approached him. His voice low, almost a whisper, said, "They don't trust you, but they've started to respect you. Stay strong. There's a chance some prisoners will be released, but you need to withstand the pressure. The next meeting will be decisive." Ali nodded silently. He knew the next day could bring the victory he sought or the end of everything. But there was something inside him that wouldn't let him back down. Because, deep down, he believed that every second spent in this fight was worth all the battles of his life. And as he lay on the narrow bed, with the window bars casting shadows on the floor, a phrase echoed in his mind like a mantra. Courage is not in never falling, but in getting up every time, even when the whole world tries to keep you down. Dawn arrived laden with uncertainty. It was the day set for the final decision. Ali walked to the negotiations room with firm steps, but his body felt the weight of sleepless nights and constant threats. The rebel leaders were already waiting for him. The silence was so thick that only the creaking of the wooden table could be heard when someone moved. The older leader spoke. "We've talked too much. Today we will decide. Either you return empty-handed, or you take something with you." Their gazes met, some filled with hostility, others with doubt. Ali remained calm, leaned forward slightly, and said, "If today is the day of choice, let it be for the right side of history. Free these men. Show the world that you are not prisoners of hate." There was a long silence. Then, slowly, the same leader raised his hand and signaled to the guards. Minutes later, footsteps echoed down the corridor. The door opened, and 4 prisoners emerged, thin, exhausted, but alive. The air filled with murmurs. Some rebels frowned in dissatisfaction, but they didn't dare stop them. The prisoners staggered. Some cried. Others simply took deep breaths as if for the first time in months. Ali stood up, approached them, and whispered, "You are free. Don't give up on life, because it's what we came to fight for." The prisoners looked at him as if they were witnessing a miracle. It wasn't liberation for all, nor was it definitive peace. But it was a a gesture that would cross oceans, showing that, amidst chaos, it was still possible to believe in humanity. Newspapers around the world reported the feat, but no headline could convey what truly happened in that suffocating room. A man, without weapons or armies, won through the power of his words and courage. As he left the country, Ali took one last look out the plane window. His body was weary, but his spirit remained intact. He knew this struggle would never end because there would always be men chained by war, by hatred, by injustice. But he also knew that every life saved was a powerful reminder, even in the deepest darkness. The light of a single gesture can change destinies. The mission ended with a simple and timeless lesson. Greatness lies not in defeating enemies in the ring, but in freeing brothers from the invisible chains that suffocate humanity.